Clayshulte with Upper Bear Creek Watershed Association. He will talk about the Bear Creek Watershed.
So I'm here wearing two hats. So I'm currently the manager with the Bear Creek Watershed Association. Recognize this is one of the older watershed associations in Colorado. So I've actually been coming up into this watershed for now over 30 years. And I was just thinking about that in perspective. I generally drive about 15,000 miles per year up in this watershed, sometimes 30 years. I put a lot of mileage in up here, so I have a pretty good understanding of what goes on. More recently, we've established the Bear Creek Watershed Foundation, which is going to be the new money arm. We've already done about 150,000 worth of projects, primarily on the water quality, but we hope to have that foundation doing more types of activities throughout the watershed, and this is part of the watershed. So the two groups we have are the foundation and the association. And the foundation is also an educational one, and it's designed to have partnerships in that education, as well as coming up with some of the funding to do projects. When you look at the Bear Creek Association, it's a fairly diverse group of people where you've got general purpose government, special district, wastewater facilities, homeowners associations, and then we bring in state, federal, and even regional agencies. So a fairly diverse group that's been put together. Currently, this is the active membership of the association where we've got the different ones broken out. And it's true, there are some that are not participating in the particular process. And although we've tried to over the years to keep them at the table, but fairly diverse group that participates throughout this particular process. So this is the Bear Creek Watershed. This is as it's actually defined within the control regulation, state regulation 74. And it ends down at Bear Creek Reservoir, but our monitoring shed actually extends down to Wadsworth, and we look at the area that's below. And there's always been a consideration of what we do as input into the lower system in South Platte, which would affect things like Bar Milton. And the top end up here is at Mount Blue Sky, the newest one. So we actually start our monitoring program up there at Mount Blue Sky, then monitor all the way down to Wadsworth. Big focus is down in the park where we're looking at Bear Creek Reservoir, and then we also look at the inputs. You can see where soda, but you'll see here where the sites come in from Turkey Creek. So Turkey Creek has always been a primary. So the one gauging station is located right there where that P116A is. So there is a gauging station, we're tracking it. We find that of interest. It's bright, and it's helped cover recently some of the cost of that one. So there's a lot of interest in what's going to happen within Bear Creek Reservoir as we move forward. Even though it's a fairly large one, it is a flood control device, so it typically sits at a lower volume, but has the ability to go up to about 93,000 acre-feet during storm events. In fact, because it is a bigger reservoir and it has a potential for additional storage, that is being considered right now by the state engineer and the Army Corps to see if they could possibly add. At one point they were looking at up to 22,000 additional acre-feet of water, which you would see would be the outer blue lines that could be stored there for use. And I know that they mentioned that the state report, when it was first issued a number of years ago, the shortfall was only about 50,000 acre-feet of water by 2050 in Colorado. That shortfall under the newest report for Colorado is 800,000 acre-feet. So there is now a tremendous amount of interest in looking at additional storage. So this will be one of the items coming up down below. One of the things that we've recognized over the years that this is a heavily used recreational watershed, including the areas up here with even more recreation proposed to come up in this area. So right now, we estimate that there's over 4.6 million visitors coming within this watershed on an annual basis, whether you can see the number of people. That was a typical weekday at Mount Blue Sky, where you have all of the people up on top up there, and then other visitors as you can see, distributed. It's a lot of fishing, a lot of other things. All of that recreational use has a big impact on the water quality within this watershed. So we have a number of regulatory concerns and challenges and goals that are coming up, and probably the biggest one we're working on right now, finishing up, is the state has run a new model for us that looks at what's called the total maximum daily load, how much nutrients can be allowed in the system and still meet state and federal standards. And so the study has come back and it's looked at, we're going to have some changes. Probably one of the biggest changes is currently under state regulation, there's over 5,255 pounds allocated amongst, at one time, 18 wastewater treatment facilities in the watershed, now down to 13. But the new modeling says that that number has got to go down below 450 pounds, could even go a little bit lower. That's coming at a big cost. That will affect the facilities even up in this area. It also means that we have to find ways to reduce the nutrients. Part of what that model is telling us is that within Bear Creek Reservoir, we have to have 95% reduction of the total phosphorus that comes out as part of the internal load. In the watershed, including the drainage on this side, we need to find a way to reduce 56% of the nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus, that are making it back into the surface waters and making it downstream. Fairly significant amount. So we have done a lot of the monitoring so we understand where some of the sources are and ways that we can be able to control it. So that's one of the big issues. One of the things that it'll do to the wastewater facilities right now, the limit is 1.0 milligrams per liter for total phosphorus in the discharge. It's going to go down to 0.2. That's a significant change. To put this in perspective, when the wastewater treatment facilities a number of years ago had to reach that 1.0 milligram per liter standards, the cost was about $18 million to the facilities. Since then, Morrison has added another $6 million for upgrades to their facilities. Total right now with all of the other facility upgrades is about $22 million. To go down to 0.2 milligrams per liter, the cost was pretty nominal, less than about $1 million for the facilities. But if we go to 0.1, we're looking at another $15 to $16 million that will need to be spent within the next 10 years to upgrade facilities. That includes facilities up here in this drainage area. That's the biggest one, so nutrient reductions in a phased approach. We've also done some other stuff. We've done some climate modeling, both for the upper part of the watershed. We've included this area over here. I'll talk about some of the climate results a little bit. We've talked about what's happening with things like with the TDS values in places here and other places. So we look at all of the water quality within this one, and part of our responsibility is to determine, are we meeting state standards? And so there's that regulatory compliance. One of the issues we raised many, many years ago with State Water Quality Control Commission was temperatures. The end result is we've put temperature probes starting up at Mount Blue Sky. We have right now 102 monitoring stations that we've used, not all the time, but for different purposes. Of those, we have 27 that we put temperature measurement devices in. We take temperature measurements every 30 minutes, and we now have about 7 million data points just on temperature. It paints a fairly dramatic picture when we look at it over the last, we actually have about 15 years worth of record now, and we can noticeably see within this watershed changes in that temperature pattern from the top of the system down to the bottom. So big implications for it in terms of that temperature. So right now we actually do have site-specific temperature standards that we've put into place. Just a few things I just want to kind of talk a little bit. Things like we do monitor surface water. We've got 2 stations over at Myers Ranch on South Turkey Creek, and then we have over at North Turkey Creek at Flying J. And this is just the record from 2015 through this last year. And you can see in terms of what we measure as specific conductivity, this has been a conversion of those numbers. So we're seeing the same thing in the surface waters. We're seeing this increase in the TDS. So it is a concern for this particular area. And to put this in perspective, if you measure the water at the top of, at Summit Lake, Mount Blue Sky up there, the value for TDS is about 5. The TDS value at Evergreen Lake comes in at about 50 to 55. So the values here are considerably higher than what we're seeing in other parts of the system. Now there are other places in this drainage where you do have high values. Rooney Gulch and the new development of Rooney Gulch blows these numbers out of the water in terms of the specific conductivity alone is coming in between 5,000 and 6,000. So the numbers are much higher in some other parts, but for the most part, fairly low. And one of our biggest concerns that we have, particularly lower in the system, and this has actually recently affected even Evergreen Lake, is these harmful algal blooms. So there has been over the years an increase in the blue-greens, and these are the ones that are producing the toxins. The increase in blue-green algae that we're seeing downstream that produce these toxins, and they have affected both animals and people in here, and it is a national concern on this increase. It's that nutrients are coming down. So we carefully look at total nitrogen, total phosphorus levels that move down through the system, and we can identify different areas. So over this 30 years of record, just even for this area, there is a notable increase over that period of time of both total nitrogen and total phosphorus coming out of the drainages, making it down below, triggering some of these issues with the harmful algal blooms. Some of that one. So where are we headed? And this is kind of a big one I want to point out because it will impact this particular area. We are going to have trading programs. We're going to have to be able to do that reduction of the total phosphorus in order for all those treatment facilities, including the ones that you saw earlier, the ones we're up here, to be able to reduce the levels. So we've already tested out some technology, pretty simple actually, the way this system works. And we can reduce between 50 and 60% of the total phosphorus. We can reduce between 50 and 55% of the total nitrogen coming through by doing treatments within tributary systems. And so in this particular Turkey Creek drainage, you can see there are actually 6 different facilities that are going to have to be looking at trading programs. Any new proposed wastewater treatment facility anywhere within this area is going to have to consider doing a trading program to get the pounds. So if we're going down from 5,255 pounds to 450, you can believe it that every facility that already exists wants every single pound that they can get their hands on. Places like Morrison already know they are not going to get enough allotted pounds, so they're going to look at trading programs. So trading is going to be something that will be of real interest in this watershed in the future. I'm just showing you this is the inflow just to kind of see how things have changed. And this is only looking at inflow into Bear Creek Reservoir. Recognize that on the main stem of Bear Creek, there's actually a 110-year record that goes back. And it is actually over that 110-year record, it's very dramatic, at least the linear decline in the amount of water. That was what triggered our interest originally in looking at the different climate models so that we could get a better sense of what's going on. But the fact is even though you get the high events, like you're looking at that one event in 2015, recognize that most of that water occurred in a 24-hour period, most of it. So climate changes. So the models are predicting for this particular watershed between 5.18 to 6.2 degree Fahrenheit increase over the annual temperatures up through 2050. That's fairly significant. That means in places like Evergreen that had 100-degree days may have as many as 500-degree days as we move into the future. Significant. More hot days means more evaporation, it's drier soil, and less infiltration is occurring. So the model for the middle one is showing that we're also going to have hotter and drier conditions, and it's going to change the timing for that precipitation. So it's going to have to start planning for hotter and drier. In fact, all of our results match out very nicely with what other state modeling results have done. Denver Water's done, and Aurora's done some good modeling. all of the numbers are predicting about the same type of thing. Important in this one is that the storm intensities change. So you may get more big ones, and we saw that back in 2015 with this, where you can end up having back-to-back 20-year events or larger events, and so you get the intense one. Unfortunately, that precipitation is also coming later in the season, so when we were in the past getting snow, you now get rain. End result is you get more surface runoff. It's not getting retained within the system, so something that'll have to be considered. So some of the changes, I just listed a few of them with the studies and stuff. The warmer temperatures, more evaporation, loss of the soil moisture. We're already seeing this. Yes, we'll have some good years for snowpack, but remember that the state snowpack is based off of a rolling average, and so even though if they say today we were normal, it doesn't necessarily, it's the same normal that it was 5 years ago, something to always keep in mind. It has been declining, everything is showing that we're seeing less of that snowpack, but more importantly, even the results that we have from real data on that 100-year record is that peak runoff from the summertime, or the peak, or spring summer runoff, has shifted earlier by 35 to 40 days. So that means that when there was snow on the ground in the past, there is not snow on the ground, a big change of what we'll have available. So earlier melt's important to look at. And then this is just showing you the Turkey Creek flow, and you can see it runs a 5-year running average on that one. So you can see in 2015, like I pointed out on the other side, single events. So you're getting big events, 20-year events. In fact, what you're represented is back-to-back 20-year events that occurred on a very short period. So obviously the big flood. So that skews out the numbers a little bit, but some of those changes, so you see that. We've also done a wildfire risk assessment, and right now probably the good one is that this area is really just in that category 2, category 1, fire risk, a little bit lower ones. Other parts of the watershed have very high risk. We know we are going to get catastrophic wildfires, and that will have an effect on the amount of infiltration and runoff and other aspects, particularly on the water quality stuff. And then we have looked at on-site systems. So currently, we know that the on-site systems are contributing to the nutrient loads. That's going to be part of that 56% reduction that we're going to have to look at in the future. So you're getting some of the material coming on. There are 9,000 on-site systems within the watershed, and potential for up to 12,000 with what we know. And that just kind of as a background, so I know that had a question was asked a little bit, like the proposed bicycle park coming up here and then adding it in terms of the nutrients, and if you have, so the kind of the bottom line answer, there's any new facility that is going to potentially generate phosphorus that can make it to surface water is going to have some kind of an allocation. Because we do have the algal problems, we do have any increase in the phosphorus within this watershed is of critical concern. And because it has an impact down through the system. So I know that's quick and it was just a brief thing, but ask me other questions when you get the chance here towards the end.
Thank you, Russ. Now we're going to switch over from water quality to quantity. In our state, we have 2 branches of government. One administers quality, another one deals with quantity. And we have Aliyah Santistevan with the State Division of Water Resources, who will talk about water rights and water administration.
Well, thank you for having me today. It looks like there's some great work being done in Conifer and Jefferson County and throughout the Bear Creek watershed, and I'm actually learning a lot and happy to be here. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about water rights and water resources. It's primarily an introduction to that, and we're going to talk a little bit about the wells, how they're integrated with the system. My name is Aliyah Santistevan. I'm an assistant division engineer in Water Division 1. The area that I cover is from the headwaters of the South Platte through the Denver metro area to Kersey. So this is part of my area within the Bear Creek watershed. We're going to talk a little bit about groundwater administration, wells, well permits, and how that integrates with our tributary framework. We're going to talk about augmentation plans and how wells are adjudicated and appropriated, and a little bit about filing requirements for well permits. So just some general terms, appropriation and adjudication are two that get commonly misunderstood. Appropriation is the application of water to a beneficial use pursuant to the procedures of law. An adjudication is a decision by the water court which confirms an appropriation. So the court is then saying you now have a priority date to operate and to divert your water. Augmentation is a plan that increases the supply of water within a stream for beneficial use. And we're going to talk a little more about augmentation plans. And then when we're talking about water administration, we always talk about senior and junior water rights. In Division 1, senior water rights are typically those with appropriation dates between 1860 and 1900. And juniors are anything more recent than 1900. Quick overview of our water law structure. The legislative branch makes laws. The judicial system, they interpret the laws, determine the water rights, and they approve plans for augmentation. The executive branch, which is the part that I'm with, we are tasked with issuing well permits and the administration, distribution, and regulation of water. And as I said earlier, we don't deal with water quality. This is just quantity of water. This is just what is being diverted from the stream and put back to the stream in amounts. So our system is really based on this concept that all water is tributary. The water within the state, underground and on the surface, is all assumed to be tributary. There's a rebuttable presumption of tributary status. And the water is usufructuary, meaning that it is owned by the people of the state of Colorado, and when you have a water right, you have the right to use something that belongs to somebody else. And so a water right is usufructuary. And it follows the prior appropriation doctrine, which is commonly referred to as time is first in line for the water. The second part of that is that even though most of this is assumed to be tributary, there are statutory exemptions. And we'll talk a little bit about those. There's non-tributary water and not non-tributary water. We have designated basin groundwater, and then exempt wells, which are outside of a designated basin, fall into this exempt statutory exemption. This is just a quick block diagram showing our tributary systems. The tributary really is in reference to connected to or contributing to the major stream systems. I really like this diagram. This is something that our office put together, and it just shows the progression of senior water rights. You can see that in the early 1860s, most of those water rights along the foothills and in the mountains have those early appropriation dates. And then the blue line is the South Platte River along the Front Range. And then you can see from the red line to the black line, as return flows were coming back from irrigation use, it started to keep the South Platte River alive later, and we see the appropriation of water in the late 1800s, 1890s, and you can just see the progression of water as it moves east. So typically this is how water rights are administered, that we see the earlier ones up close to the mountains, but then we throw on a bunch of wells, and it kind of creates a little havoc when you have wells that are adjudicated and appropriated in the 1930s up into modern, current times. We still are issuing well permits and adjudicating water rights today. In terms of how the river is administered, the South Platte River or any river, we do this system of water rights of seniority, and I just want to show this is how one day, July 23rd in 2007, the calls on the Platte River, where we were trying to get water to the senior-most water rights. On this day, we had a Lower Latham call, that was bypassing from the Brantner Ditch, so we had an 1881 priority on. It was a bypass call, meaning that the Brantner was bypassing a little bit of water to give it what it needed, in addition to what was coming down the St. Vrain and the Big Thompson. And then Below that, we had a Sterling #1 bypass from the lower Beaver Ditch. That went into District 64. We had calls at the Harmony. That was a bypass from the Bravo. And then we had the Peterson ditch on, and we had a compact call on. So it gets pretty complicated, and we have these types of scenarios where there's all these senior water rights calling for water, and depending on the tributary branches coming down to the South Platte, it makes a difference in who can take water or not. This is just another diagram to show kind of what the flows are in the river on a typical call pattern. This is actually in the winter filling reservoirs. You can see where the graph first comes down to about the 0 line. Jackson Lake was sweeping the river, we say, or taking all the stream flow in the river. And then we see this accumulation of water back in the stream from return flows, from recharge, from other things. And then we see the next dry up at North Sterling. And so we end up drying the river about 3 or 4 times, typically in the lower end of the South Platte River. So that water is being used and reused quite a bit along the main stems. So then I want to talk a little bit about wells. So how do wells interact with all of this? This is how we're administering the river. Most wells are non-exempt wells. They are administered in priority along with these other senior water rights and junior water rights. And it's an in priority system. In order for the wells to operate, typically they need to be within an augmentation plan, meaning that the wells pump water from the aquifer that causes a depletion to the stream, and that depletion needs to be replaced in an appropriate time, location, and amount. And that's what the augmentation plan does. It typically involves a senior water supply as a replacement source that's being introduced back to the stream so that the well can pump and cause those depletions, and with the return from the senior water, it kind of makes up the difference. So it's these intricate plans to put water back into the stream at one location so it can be taken out at another. All non-exempt wells need to be permitted. We saw that within that statutory framework, the legislature said that wells must be permitted through the state engineer's office. There's also the exempt wells we talked a little bit about. Those are exempt from administration within the priority system, but they also must be permitted. So all wells within the state are permitted. Not all wells need to be augmented. Non-exempt wells are exempt from augmentation. So when we're talking about well permits, a well permit is not a water right. A well permit is really just setting forth the conditions for the drilling, the installation of that well. And if a well permit is issued pursuant to a decree, or if a well has a decree, the well permit will reflect those terms of the decree. But well permits and decrees are two separate things. And you don't necessarily need a decree in order to operate a well. You need an augmentation plan typically. So the framework of groundwater administration is non-exempt wells need to be administered in priority, or they need to be augmented. Wells may be adjudicated, but it's not necessary. And one other thing I wanted to throw in here when we're talking about wells is that a well is defined as any structure or device used for the purpose or with the effect of obtaining groundwater for beneficial use. So any ponds that are constructed in lowland areas that intercept groundwater are also technically considered wells. So just real quick, for a non-exempt well, you need an augmentation plan in order to operate that. The 1969 Act recognized groundwater as being tributary. You don't necessarily need a water right, but you need an aug plan. You could potentially get a water right, and we see this quite a bit where homeowners, well owners will opt to get a decree for their well, but it's not necessary. And then once the court has approved an aug plan, then it comes to my office and we administer the water rights. final thing here is that, as I mentioned before, well permits are always required for the operation of a well. So it's a little different for an exempt well. There's statute that has been written by the legislator that says it is in the best interest of the state that some wells can operate without the need for an augmentation plan. And that's what is established as exempt framework. There's certain things that we consider when issuing well permits. There's a 600-foot spacing requirement that you cannot construct a well within 600 feet of another well. There's this no injury presumption that exists for pre-1972 subdivisions. So all of this was written into the legislation. And these permits are really limited to, for residential purposes, no more than 15 gallons a minute. There is a commercial exemption as well, that's 50 gallons a minute. And they're limited to in-house use on lands less than 35 acres. So for less than 35 acres, you cannot be irrigating lawns, gardens, livestock, anything like that. Those are limited to in-house use only. And then for over 35 acres, there are allowed uses for livestock and the irrigation of lawns. So kind of flow through that same process as we did before. The law has been established for an exempt well. You can get a water right, but you don't need it. And what typically happens is that for an exempt well, you file a notice with our office, the state engineer's office. And if it meets the exempt well criteria, you will be issued a well permit and you can go ahead and construct that well. Some, like I said earlier, some well owners do opt to get a water right for their well. And what that typically can do is maybe give you standing if you wanted to object to what was going on in the resume. I might be talking too technical here, but every application within the water court comes through is published in what's called the resume. And if a homeowner wanted to object to something going on, they would have to show that they have a water right or standing to object to what was happening in that court process. And so I think there's times where people have opted to get a water right for standing in those water court objections. But to reiterate, for an exempt well, all that is necessary is a well permit recognizing the exempt well status. Just real quick, we talked briefly about plans for augmentation, but these are some graphics that kind of show how that works. When the well is pumping out of the stream system, it's causing this depletion to the stream. That water that is being pumped by the well would otherwise be available to the stream system at a later time, at a later location, and that's part of what the aug plan does, is determine the timing and location of where those depletions might occur to. If those depletions aren't replaced, there's less water available to those senior water rights, and as we saw, the river's very busy. There's a lot of senior water rights calling for that water. So it would cause injury to those senior water rights. So the plan for augmentation prevents injury by replacing water back to the stream system in a manner that prevents injury to the senior water rights. And accordingly, all augmentation plans, my office works with applicants on those plans, every plan needs to be approved by the court. The court has jurisdiction over these augmentation plans. Just a couple other things I wanted to mention about augmentation plans. Up here in this area, Mountain Mutual North Fork Associates has been the predominant provider of replacement water. They are now out on Turkey Creek. There's no more water available. We're starting to see where maybe water was dedicated to a plan, previous plans, and they didn't need all of that, so we're starting to carve out some of that. We're seeing where they're carving out some of that excess water and using that for new plans, but the availability of replacement water in this area is pretty tight or non-existent at this point. Augmentation plans require engineering to determine the depletion amounts, the timing. There is a certain type of temporary augmentation plan, which we call a substitute water supply plan. Those can be approved by our office without going through water court. There's a lot of nuances tied to those, but they are an option. And most augmentation plans require continued maintenance. They require accounting, they require monthly reporting and measurement, and they are administered by my office. Just real quick, something we see all the time, advertisements for home sales. This one caught my eye. I apologize, it's a little blurry, but this listing, you know, it mentions that there's an impressive adjudicated well that comes with this piece of property. So immediately, what would you think when it says an impressive well? In my mind, I'm thinking, is it augmented? Is it exempt? Because you may not be able to use it even though there's a well on that property. The questions that should come up is it an log plan or is it exempt? If it's neither of the two, this well is not going to provide any service. Real quick, well permits. These are all available now online through our website. Water well permit application is what's needed to get started. There's a statement of beneficial use once the pump has been installed. There's a well construction and test report which gives the depth of the well and all the parameters of how the well and the pump were constructed. And then there's a change of ownership, and that's required by statute. If you buy a property that has a well, you're required to change the ownership. The last thing, here's my last slide, is just some contact information. Hopefully this is available later, but if you would like to get a hold of me, my phone number is here. I'm the Assistant Division Engineer. The Division Engineer in Division 1 is Corey DeAngelis. Tim Buckley is the Water Commissioner in this area. If you all have questions or concerns about water in the area, I suggest you first contact Tim or myself. We will be able to provide the quickest response to you. We also have the Ask DWR system within our website. If anybody ever goes to our website, you can ask a question through Ask DWR. We try to get those answered within a day or two. Just real quick too, we have a new state engineer, Jason Ullman, and then in Denver, Kate Fuller is our team member who does most of the well permits and will work with most of the underground well water stuff in this area. That's the last slide I have, so thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Aliyah. And now we'll wrap up with Heather Gutherless. She's with Jefferson County Planning and Zoning. She's frequently comes to our town hall meetings and always has some great insights. Heather?
Thank you, Peter. I am going to do the same thing that Roy did and test this because I know I have had issues with the pointer before, but it looks like I've got it this time. So today I'm going to talk about some of the things that have been covered. Well, I'm going to relate back to those to talk about how the county uses a lot of this information when we receive a proposal for development. So I'm going to go through some of the county policies and regulations that we currently have in effect. Also talk about then how those policies directly relate to development cases, and then also relate it into even a more micro level into building permits. So this slide shows the various county policy and regulatory documents that the county has. We have the county's comprehensive master plan, and that is an advisory document that looks at the vision for the future of Jefferson County, specifically related to growth and development. Then we have two different regulatory documents. Our zoning resolution is our regulatory document that looks at land use standards, such as what uses are allowed on a property, what kind of building, lot and building standards are required, so what the minimum lot sizes should be, what setbacks should be, so how far away a building can be from a property line. And then it also contains a lot of overlay districts, different architectural standards, lighting standards, things like that. Last, our land development regulation is a much more technical document. It really relates to when people want to come in and they've got their uses in place, and then they want to subdivide or actually construct the building, and what kind of standards they need to follow. A lot more technical, more related to like drainage and transportation, gets into a lot of the technical reports related to wildfire and water that we require. So first I'm going to go over the comprehensive master plan, and currently we have in the comprehensive master plan, it is divided into two major sections. One is our development review section, and these are the goals and policies that specifically relate to a development proposal. So in this section, we have goals and policies. We have 4 goals and 11 policies that specifically relate to water quality, water quantity, and then because such a large portion of the county is served by wells and on-site wastewater treatment systems, we have several goals related to those. A couple of definitions that I really wanted to point out that are really relevant to this section is the locally available water resources and adequate water supplies. We added these definitions into our comprehensive plan because we wanted to make sure it was clear what the county was looking for as development proposals came forward. So with the locally available water resources, you'll notice that we define that as surface or groundwater that's physically on the site of the development. So this doesn't include water that's brought to the site, such as water hauling or a pipeline. It would mostly include those things like if somebody has a well or if somebody has surface water rights. And then adequate water supplies is a water supply that meets applicable drinking water standards, meets minimum supply quantity, and is sustainable both physically and legally. The other large section of our comprehensive plan is our long-range planning section. This section of the plan covers what are we looking for into the future. If we were to update our plans, these policies apply. If we were looking at regulation amendments, we would be looking to these policies to see how we should update our regulations. This also talks about different programs. If the county has the resources, what types of programs would we like to implement? And what type of additional coordination do we think we need? Maybe we need to start setting up more meetings. I know that the Bear Creek Watershed Association is one of those areas where we want to make sure we continue to coordinate with the different water associations and divisions within that, and districts within that watershed authority. And then we also have, in addition to our comprehensive master plan, which applies everywhere in the county, we also have our 8 different area plans. Now this is because Jefferson County is a very large county. We have a very diverse geologic region that we cover, geographic and geologic. And so we have 8 different area plans because Conifer, it's not quite the same as our North Plains area where Lake Westminster, Nevada is. We want to acknowledge those differences in character and the differences in constraints that each area pose. So how many of you here worked on any of the Conifer plan updates over the years? There's been 3. Yeah, I see a few. Thank you for your time in working on those because we really need citizen input when we develop those plans. We look for citizen input, agency input, any specific nonprofits that are in the area, and it's very important to our planning process. The Conifer plan, because it is in the mountain areas, we see a lot of our mountain plans have even additional water policies. So in the Conifer plan, we have 16 additional water policies that we would look at when a development proposal comes in. And those relate to all of the things on the screen, all the way from balancing groundwater, well tests, clustering systems, a lot of different things are covered. Next, I'm going to get into our regulations, starting with our zoning resolution, because there is a very important overlay district that is in our zoning resolution, which is the Mountain Groundwater Overlay District. Peter did a great job of going through what the fractured crystalline rock aquifer is, and this Mountain Groundwater Overlay District applies to that area. So where all those fractured rock is, That is where this regulation applies. So mainly up in our mountain areas. And we established this in 2007 to recognize the water resource issues that we have in that portion of the county. This map shows approximately where that boundary line is for the water overlay district. It's generally above 6,400 feet in elevation, which is generally where that rock type changes from what's in the plains areas to this fractured rock aquifer. The regulations in this section apply to a variety of different development cases in different ways. So we have our rezonings and special uses, which are applications to actually change the land use on a property. Then we also have additional requirements for our plats and site development plans, and those are the processes where somebody has that land use in place and they want to actually split up lots, or they want to construct a new commercial or multifamily building. That's when those regulations come into place. And the overlay applies to anybody coming in to get a new building permit for a new home. And one thing that I do want to note about the overlay district is that it only applies to areas that are not already within a water and sanitation district. So areas that rely on water supply wells. So if somebody was in Evergreen Water and Sanitation District, this regulation would not apply. It only applies to areas that are served by wells. So for rezonings and special uses, we apply the policies from the comprehensive master plan to a development, and also the regulations that are in our overlay district. The applicant provides several documents. They will provide the estimated water requirements for the proposed uses, documentation that the water source is legally available, and a key difference here with our next slide is or plans for how to obtain it if there's a future county process. So if we know somebody is going through rezoning and their next step is going to be a subdivision plat or site development plan, somebody can provide plans and say, hey, we're planning on going through water court in order to obtain additional water rights to supply this. If they are not going through another process, they need to provide that all with the rezoning process or special use. And then the water supply summary form really gives us a lot of information about where the water is coming from, well or district. Again, it talks about those estimated water requirements and a lot of other information. Staff uses all of the information that's provided to complete a water availability analysis. And I'm going to go through what a water availability analysis is in more detail in a little bit, but it's basically a simplified water budget. What kind of water is being proposed to be taken out of the system and what is going back into the system. Now, if that water availability analysis shows that the water requirement for the development proposal exceeds this 0.2 acre feet per acre per year, which is approximately equal to 250 gallons per day per acre, which is approximately, as an example, an exempt household use only well permit allows up to 300 gallons per day. So that gives you a little bit of frame of reference for how much water that is. Then we require that the applicant do an aquifer test, and they would need to hire a consultant to do that aquifer test. Moving on to the plat and site development plan, we get more information because we're a little bit closer to building. So at this stage, only our regulations are evaluated. At this point, since the land uses are already in place, the comprehensive plan policies do not apply. And the applicant provides a lot of the same information that they would for the rezoning, such as the estimated water requirements, the water supply summary form, but they have to go a little bit deeper. They have to provide the legal right to the water supply, so they either have to show us that well permit that allows them to use the water, or they have to show us the water rights that they have to be able to do the development. They also have to start getting into water quality. So they have to do some testing of a range of certain items that are in our regulations, and they have to show us what the results of that is. Then, again, staff completes a water availability analysis, but the threshold for that aquifer test goes down. So if the water requirement exceeds 0.1 acre-feet per year, which is about 90 gallons per day per acre, then an aquifer test is required. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this water availability analysis, which we fondly refer to as the WA. And this is an amazing model. When I first started at the county, we did not have this, and so we relied a lot on the legality of water. But this, after the Turkey Creek Watershed study that was referenced earlier in this presentation, the county had a lot more information about water in the mountainous areas in this fractured rock system, and created a ArcGIS model, which is a Geographic Information System model. And it was created in coordination with some really smart people at the Colorado Division of Water Resources, Colorado Geological Survey, US Geological Survey, Colorado Water Science Center, also citizens. We have a lot of citizens in our mountain areas that have water expertise, water resource consultants, and developers. So it was a very comprehensive process to evaluate all of the data we received from the Turkey Creek Watershed study and see how can we apply that and create this model. And the model also automatically gathers information from various sources that are listed there. The great thing about the WA is that it creates a standardized approach to evaluating water. Before we had this, a lot of times you would see dueling water consultants. A developer would come in and they would hire their own water consultant to evaluate things, and they would say something, and then citizens would hire their own water consultant and it might say something different, and you'd get to the commission hearings and the commissioners would have to figure out how to evaluate all of this. So this WA is something that was done in coordination with all these different agencies and consultants so that we have a very consistent evaluation of the proposed water supply for these developments. This map shows an example of a map that is generated from our WA. This is not a current development proposal. This was one that actually was probably 8 to 10 years ago. And you can see we plot out where the development proposal is, and that's in red. And then you have heard about the different watersheds. So there was the Bear Creek watershed, the Turkey Creek watershed. We go a step further and go to the sub-basin watershed. So we look at where the sub-basin watershed area is, all of the different wells that are already allowed in that area, and we look at what amount of water are they allowed to pull out of the system. So this isn't what they do pull out of the system, but what they could potentially, at their max, pull out of the groundwater. We get that information, like I talked about before, for what the development's proposed uses are and what the water use for those are. And then with all of the information from the Turkey Creek Watershed study, what is that recharge from precipitation and from septic systems? And we use all of this information to figure out whether a new proposal will have an impact to both the legal and the physical amount of water in this subbasin. So will that new development pull out enough water that we think it will have a detrimental impact to the surrounding areas? Last, I was going to talk about building permits. Building permits with the Water Overlay District do have additional requirements. Again, when I first started at the county, all that we required for a building permit was that somebody have a well permit. They show us they have that legal source of water. Now we require a 4-hour well yield test. Now we won't not issue a building permit if somebody has a low 4-hour well yield test, but then we would, if it's less than 1 gallon per minute, then we require a minimum of 300 gallons of storage. And this can either be through the well bore, which I know there were lots of slides about the well bore and how that can store water for households, or it can be through a cistern that's on the property. And that's just to make sure that there is an adequate amount of water for residents on a regular basis. So that kind of summarizes what I talked about. One thing that I do want to talk about that is an ongoing process with the county is our Together Jeffco process. We are looking at updating our comprehensive plan, the Transportation Mobility Plan, Community Wildfire Protection Plan, Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan Evacuation Annex, and creating from the zoning resolution and the land development regulation, combining those into a unified land use code. So we're going to be looking at the policies that we have regarding water in our comp plan, and we're also going to be looking at the regulations that we have and having potential updates to those as we see that they are needed. So I wanted to let everybody know about that. If you are interested in knowing more, go to togetherjeffco.com. You can sign up to get email updates and to receive updates on any major meetings or events that we have. If you have any questions, I do not recommend that you talk to my cute little dog because he only cares about drinking water and not being sprayed by it. But you can contact me at Heather H. Gutherless at jeffco.us or my phone number. I tend to be more responsive to emails, just to let you know. I can check those at a variety of times a day. And then Pat O'Connell is our engineering geologist, and he is a fabulous resource for all things water related. He really has a lot of knowledge and was involved in the creation of our WA. So he is like the expert in all things water related to development at Jeffco, and his information is there as well. Thank you. I think that concludes all of our sessions today.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, that is the conclusion of the presentations. Now we have time for questions. And I have 5 cards here. If anybody else has some questions written down, Jennifer is going to come around and gather them. And I guess maybe, I was going to have the speakers all sit up here, but we could just mingle here and go through the questions because there aren't that many. And we may get out much earlier. We came prepared for a large crowd, but I realize with the graduation ceremonies and this wonderful weather that the crowd didn't materialize. And when you get a big crowd, you can get questions all over the place. So we want to kind of keep a valve on how we deal with them. And after we're done with the written down ones, maybe we can open it up for a little more general discussion. Okay, so speakers, let's see. Aliyah and Heather, we'll just sit, if you feel, you can stay where you are. There's no need to all sit up here. The first card here is 2 questions. Oh, actually, there's 4. There's questions on the back side. My house was built in 1975. I bought it 10 years ago. Not sure how deep my well is, size of my septic tank is. Is there a way to find this information? Yes, there are ways to find it. There's no guarantee you'll find the records easily. And Aliyah and Roy might have more comments on this. There should be a permit with that well, and there should be a well completion report in the permit file. And you can go to the state engineer's office website, go to their mapping tool, look for it. Caveats on that: older wells may have been located by quarter section, and there may be 15 wells on one spot. You don't know which of those wells goes with your house. It takes a little bit of digging. And when a property is exchanged, there should be a change of ownership that goes in there, but they don't always get filed. It's a problem with our system, especially if you go back that far. Same with the county health department finding permits on on-site wastewater treatment system. There should be permit data on there. Aliyah, you have anything else to say on?
Just the one thing to add to that is that you can search by property address, you can search by name, and you can search by map location. So if you can't find it with one of those three methods, I would suggest just contacting either Tim Buckley or myself, and we can try to help you with that.
And I really want to vouch for how awesome the CDWR well permit search website is. I use it all the time. First time or two, it always takes a little learning curve to figure out how to navigate a website. But theirs is really great. It even has this little moving thing that tells you, hey, if you want to look up an address, here's where it goes. So it's a great tool. And like Aliyah says, you give them a phone call too. So if you have struggled with it. As far as septic system permits, we do have an online portal. And as Peter said, certainly built at that time 75. They should have pulled a septic system permit, but we do find bootleg systems from time to time. So we may or may not have a record on it. And then you said you bought it 10 years ago. That should have been subject to what we call this use permit program. And what we do is, at the time of sale, the seller of the property is required to get a use permit. The purpose of that use permit is, the first thing is, find out if we have a record or not. Then there's also an inspection that's done of it to tell us what the condition of that septic system is at this time. And that kind of helps, buyer, certainly protects the buyer a little bit, because then they're going to get an evaluation of the septic system. And it also protects the seller, and it also protects the real estate agent, so there aren't any lawsuits down the road about, hey, you didn't tell us that you had a defective system and that it was fine for you as one person living in the house. Now I've moved in there with 6 people, and all of a sudden things are bubbling out of the ground. So that's why that use permit program is in place. So first thing is, you can look it up online. And the second thing is, give us a call or shoot us an email, JCPH, OWTS, septic systems, however you want to connect with us, or call. Yes, you can still use the phone and call. So many ways to get access to your septic system.
Okay, next question, Roy, you may want to stay standing. I've had my water tested a few years ago. Reports were good. They have so many things to test for, mostly for bacteria. Living by King Soopers, should I have any other tests besides for bacteria?
Yes, you should probably test for more than bacteria, and not just because of King Soopers, but again, now we're starting to talk about a little bit more intense development of the land. I don't know whether the gas station is nearby, or if there's any auto body shops, or what else is in that neighborhood. But yeah, since the further you get away from those kind of more heavily used areas, the less concerns you have. But you still come back to the natural contaminants that are out there: radionuclides, uranium, hardness or softness of your water, and now, as we've talked about, this TDS, this total dissolved solids. So there are a couple of other things you might consider testing for, and that's where I'll say, hey, let's follow up, shoot me an email, give me a phone call, and we can see, look at some of the data that we have and say, hey, here's some of the other analytes that we've seen in that area, or whether, even if we don't have data there, we might be able to suggest a couple of other over and above just the bacteria test. And I did mention nitrate. If you're in an area where there's a lot of septic systems, nitrate should be on your list of annual testing.
Russ, did you mention in that area there was a historic problem with a denabble, dense non-aqueous, that the EPA was working on? So depending on where you are, Maybe.
Yeah, you can actually look that one up online. Tetrachloride, I think carbon tetrachloride was released there. They've got that well documented. That was in the mid-1990s, I think, when they found that plume. So they know where the plume is, and I think there's still a pump and treat going on. And then a number of households are being monitored on a routine basis. So it's well documented, well known. They know kind of the area that it's affected. And that's another one. Give me a call and I can hook you up with the website. Or I think if you just look online, Aspen Park, Carbon Tet, water quality, you can try to find that. But if you can't find it, give me a call and then you can learn a little bit about that. But like I said, it's been under the radar since 1995 at least, and they've done a good job of mitigating that.
And we have two more on this card. Any large development up here, such as the bike park, would increase phosphorus levels. How? Russ, do you think you might be able to address that?
Well, actually, it gets back to that line of P's that we saw that Roy put up there for us. So if you've got any kind of additional development up here where you're going to have more day uses or other uses into there, you're going to generate waste products. P's set it all up there so that you're generating additional phosphorus, or additional nitrogen. So we know it gets back in the systems. There was an inadvertent test that we did a few years ago that kind of shows this. So when we had the major flood events back in 2015, and we ended up getting a lot of runoff, it created a great deal of flushing, particularly alluvial flushing. And we immediately went out after this flushing event within days, and we did nitrogen and phosphorus sampling at strategic locations. And we found that most of the areas that the nutrients got stripped out to the tune of about 22,000 pounds, making it down to Bear Creek Reservoir. Within a month and a half, we saw the levels start to return back for the nutrients at some of those same surface water test sites. So the bottom line is, you get any kind of development, you're going to be generating additional nutrients up in the watershed. And we know that they're coming back out, particularly some of the areas where we have a lot of on-site systems. That was classic in this one, where we saw that rapid return of those nutrients. So if you're going to have a bike facility, what was 190,000 users coming in here, they're going to generate additional waste. They're going to generate additional phosphorus. If it is above that on-site system limit, 2,000 gallons per day, and it's a treatment system, then the big thing is those facilities are going to have phosphorus pounds under regulation. They'll have to have it designated. They'll have to have it as part of a permit system. And with the pounds getting greatly reduced, that's going to require having to mitigate for any additional increase in phosphorus.
Okay, one last one here on the card. Recently, there was no water at Supers and any nearby business. Was that a problem just for that area? I don't know anything about that. I would say it's most likely they had an infrastructure issue, pumping or piping, something either failed or needed maintenance and they shut down. If anybody's heard anything about that, speak up. I don't know of a specific instance there. We also had power outages. Was it close to the timing with that big power outage that pumps could have shut down? Something may have failed as a result of that. I would suspect it's infrastructure with the water supply system. That's centralized system. If any part of that centralized system goes down, everybody's going to be affected. This one is for Russ and Heather. Why has Bear Creek Watershed Association not been included in formal referrals for major projects up in Turkey Creek Watershed? Conifer Commons, behind Safeway, Conifer Heights, Shadow Mountain Bike Park. These questions have all been very good. You guys have done a great job. Russ, do you want to?
Simple answer on that is we have been involved. We are a designated referral agency for Jefferson County. So any project that is going forward, we're being provided some of the information. Now there's limits on when we can respond back to some of the stuff the way it's set up, but we are a referral agency. So all the developments, in fact, in ones like the Conifer Corners, I've actually been working with them. We're looking to see if we can find a better solution than the concept of having an additional wastewater facility. We created years and years ago a plan for this area on wastewater treatment, and part of that deals with this concept of consolidation, where we did not want to see a proliferation of small wastewater treatment facilities because they're extremely difficult to manage from a water qualities perspective. And so yes, we've been involved, and so we get the opportunity to provide comments back to the county on any of the developments.
Yeah, thanks. What Russ is saying is correct. We have something called a universal referral matrix that we have for staff to use to make sure that we involve various referral agencies throughout the process. I know that as Russ was responding, I heard some murmurs that no, people weren't being referred. So if there is an issue with a specific development case, it may indicate that we might need additional training to make sure that that universal referral matrix is being used appropriately, because we do want to make sure that all of our referral agencies are being appropriately referred on these development proposals.
You haven't been referred for Shadow Mountain Bike Park in the formal case files of the planning and zoning thing for it, to my knowledge. You may be active, but you have not responded formally to the case file.
That's a difficult one. We actually did make a response back when it was first brought up to us, only in the aspect of if there was going to be a wastewater treatment facility required, then we would be able to deal with it. So we made some comments about that in the beginning, and then afterwards there are certain places in the referral system where we can comment, and there are other places in the referral system where we don't necessarily get asked. So.
Yeah, and just to go back to that, I know that after the first referral, we usually winnow down, what am I trying to say? Winnow down the number of referral agencies that get a second or a third referral based on the comments that we receive, and whether those comments are items that can be addressed with the process that we're in, or if they would be comments that then we'll need to refer back to them if the development is approved and when there is a future process. So that could be part of it. And I see another question out there.
It's my understanding that with the second and third referrals, that the developers have changed their number of guests from 300 to 1,200 per day, and I think that would have a different response from Barkmann Watershed. Am I correct?
I don't know the details of the case as well as like the case manager would. I know that they have looked at limits on the number of guests. Typically, if a development proposal increases the intensity, then we do send it out on a larger referral again. But if it decreases, which it sounds like maybe this could be an increase, but I don't know the details of that. So I would have to look into it with the case manager to see if that's something that should have been referred out again, if there was an increase in the number of users of the park. I thought it was unlimited at first, and then they made a limit, and then they decreased it more. So I could be wrong about that, though.
I think you were mistaken.
I know this is a contentious issue up here, and I think we should move on. I would recommend you contact the case manager on that with detailed questions on this. Who is that, Heather? For the bike park, case manager?
Yeah, it's Dylan Monk, and I don't know his phone number offhand. I didn't bring my bag with me, but I know his email address would be dmonke, M-O-N-K-E, @jeffco.us.
Thank you. Okay, this one says for John W. and Peter B., but I think Aliyah might have comments, and this may be for everybody in a way. If the water discharged at the surface near Sinclair gas station from the CSA-CWA Staples Center was actually returned to groundwater in the Conifer Area Activity Center, how would your long-term static well surface look like? Well, my understanding, this has to go with your adjudicated water rights. I believe they're required to return to surface water. Other centralized systems are required to return to groundwater, and this is in their adjudicated water right. And Jefferson County's land use policies for water, we want new developments to recharge. So there are many layers to this onion on where this gets discharged. So I think it has to do with their water rights. Aliyah, do you have any? Did you hear that? There's an augmentation plan that says you will return it to surface water.
No, but if there was no augmentation plan, it said that you had to not return it to surface discharge, what would it look like? That's the big question. That would totally upend your modeling if it had to go back into the groundwater.
So here's a thought, because again, I'm still trying to understand this question. So, and again, I'll go back to it. So there's the Conifer Water Association. Are you talking about Conifer Metro District or Conifer Water?
No, the discharge at the Sinclair, that had to go back into the groundwater.
Okay.
If it had to.
Oh.
If it did, and you were now running that model, what would your deal look like if you were really trying to get it all back into the groundwater?
Good question, and so I got to work on it a bit. And timer, would you give me 3 minutes? It's going to take about 3 minutes. So let's go back before Conifer Metro District. And now we're just going to look at the Conifer Water Association, Staples Center, and that little plaza there. So there's a few groundwater wells there that supply the water supply. And then what they were required to do at that time was they treated it right next to that little Sinclair stinker station. Am I in the right place? Yeah. So they used to treat it right there and then discharge it to the surface. So your question is, well, what if they didn't do that and they actually tried to put it back on within where those wells are? Would it change the groundwater levels? And so I'm going to go back to saying, well, this is that question about mining water. So if we look at the wells that are at the Conifer Water Association that they draw from, and then we look at, are those water levels changing over time, and are they really declining over time, then we would say, hey, yeah, we're mining water from this area, and if we would return the water there, maybe we could stabilize that flow, okay? Now I want to go over to Conifer Metro District, which is exactly what their augmentation plan required. They're going to pump water out of the ground over here at Conifer Metro District, and they're going to treat it, really high-level treatment. I mean, this is a nice plan, as long as everything's operated and maintained properly, and then recharge the groundwater right on the property. So now we've got two different places that we could look at. This goes back to the importance of long-term records to watch water levels over time to see if, like, hey, over here at the Conifer Water Association, Staples Plaza, we are really mining the water and the water levels are dropping, and that's causing water to flow in from the surrounding areas. And then we compare it over here to Conifer Metro, where they're required to discharge it there. Is there an overall effect? So good question. The answer would lie in looking at the monitoring wells around, or the pumping and monitoring wells around the Staples Plaza area, and see what's happening to the water levels. And then if they're staying the same as they were when they first started pumping, then maybe requiring it to discharge back to the fractured rock isn't necessary, because overall the water levels aren't changing. So if we're really talking about that stabilized water availability, is my time up? Okay, long past it. But I think that's a great question, and I think that's another thing that this is what this group is really trying to do, is let's look at some of those things gather the data, just like they did with TDS, and gather these static water level data that can tell us, like, hey, locally, we're really running out of water fast, or not. So I think that's an awesome next year's project.
There you go. This is very complicated too, because as John showed, if you return to the aquifer, you just you increase the load, TDS and other elements into your aquifer, and he shows how the discharge is increasing over time. That's because the recharge is working and they're pumping it back out, but they keep recycling in the same loop, and it just ends up gradually increasing the load at your site. Or if you discharge it to the surface water, you send it down to rust, and so that becomes a problem further down the watershed. It's that load, and what do you do with it? And I can't underemphasize how great it would be if we could collect more water level data. We really need to work on that. Okay, another question here that's for me and all. Fire mitigation, landscape level tree cutting up to $60 billion is in the pipeline for tree culling. How will this impact the water balance, both surface and subsurface? Relief from environmental impact studies. You know, I had a very similar question at the break on what happens after a wildfire. And there's no easy answer on this. When you remove a lot of tree cover, initially you'll lose some evapotranspiration, that's good. You also lose snowfall staying in the canopy where it sublimates right away. So you may get more snow on the ground to melt over time to recharge the aquifer. Eventually, if you increase grasslands, you might get higher ET because of the grasslands in there. There's no easy answer to that. With a wildfire, then you get massive disturbance to the land surface. You can have post-wildfire flood events, debris flows where the water just goes right off. You can get hardening of the soils because they're baked by the fire. Then you don't get the recharge. Yeah, any way you look at it, there will be an effect on the water balance. It just depends, how it impacts the snowpack, your runoff, vegetation. It impacts evapotranspiration. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? No easy answer on that.
Well done for not an easy answer.
Knowing what you know about water availability and wastewater laws, how can you accept any development application without an accredited water and drainage plan as a requirement for acceptance for planning and zoning? I might be able to add to it too.
And could you repeat the question? I only got about part of it. How do we know about water availability and wastewater loss? How can we accept any development application? So how can we accept any development application? That's one of the things we look at as we get development applications. So planning and zoning, one thing that you should know is that we can't just automatically reject any development application. Our responsibility is to objectively analyze any development application that comes into the county. And so that's why we ask for the various items and documents to then be able to do our water availability analysis and determine whether a development will have an impact to the subbasin for water or whether it would not, whether there is already adequate water in that basin to support additional development. I don't know if there were more answers to that question. I saw that it was for planning and zoning and somebody else, if they had any comments.
I would just make a comment that given that we don't have a lot of really solid empirical data to go by, whatever we do in the water availability analysis is probably the best way to look at what's available for a development. You know, it's the best we can do with the kind of data that's available, and then we have property rights. You can't tell somebody they can't do something with their property they want to because they've got rights to use their land. So it's a really delicate balance that the county, that Heather's department has to walk in here on how you try to evaluate whether you can make a development work given the issue of sustainability. It's the tools we have in our toolkit.
I want to clarify that planning staff cannot reject an application. However, then it goes to our decision-making bodies. Our planning commission makes a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, and the Board of County Commissioners can approve with conditions, or deny any land use application. So it's really up to them. Staff analyzes it, but at our level, we cannot reject an application.
Okay, what is an acceptable level of radon in water? EPA does not have a standard, but have seen suggested limits between 4,000 and 10,000 picocuries per liter. Is radon in water a concern at all if you have mitigation systems for air? If yes, what is a good method for treatment? Roy?
Ouch. There's a lot in there. While I'm thinking, does anybody else have an answer that they'd like to give? We're not, you know, it's interesting because the level of radon in water can be quite high. Like you said, 3, 4, 10,000 picocuries per liter. And so it's interesting that we're really not as concerned about your exposure when you drink it, okay? But when it gets into the air, because again, it doesn't seem to have that bad impact on your digestive system. But when it aerosolizes or when it's airborne, then we're worried about the impact to your lungs. So that's the really target organ that we're concerned about with radon, and that's why we measure it in the air, and that action level is 4 picocuries per liter. But it's a good idea, and this is where, again, we want to kind of look at specific areas, because, again, it's driven by the geology. This is a naturally occurring element, and it comes from the nature of the rocks that are in there, and whether that's being brought into the water column and then into your water that you're bringing in. So I'll get back to where the answer is again, or what the question is again, but we're more concerned about it airborne. It looks like it's got to be up to 10,000 units in water before we're looking at maybe 1 count in air. So there's that conversion factor. And again, showers and that kind of thing is what can release it. But so I want to follow up on it because there's so much good information and they won't butcher it like I did. And that's why shoot me an email, give me a call, and we can dive deeper into radon, certainly in air versus radon in water, and when you should or shouldn't test for it. Does that help at all with your question?
Let me add to that just a little bit.
Yeah.
Water aeration systems are very effective
Yes.
for radon in the water.
Yes.
The EPA proposed standard of 4,000 has been out there for 20 plus years. It's kind of general guidance, but radon in water is a complicated issue because of you mentioned the 1 in 10,000 conversion. That assumes equal dispersion and all of that. But there are systems out there that are fairly effective, in fact, very effective. Basically, the idea is to do a combination of spraying or air injection to vent it off and eject it outside. So that's the best treatment for it, and fairly common and fairly easy to do.
Yeah, and we did do. We got a state radon grant where for 25 years, one of our colleagues was testing for radon and radionuclides, and we have that data. But yeah, there were a few that exceeded the 10,000, And so people did put in these water aeration systems, just like you described. And it's he always described it as it's almost like an aquarium, where you're kind of bubbling air through the water, and then the radon moves from the water into the air, and then that air can be gathered and discharged outside of the house.
That's exactly
So
right.
exactly like you described. So, yeah.
Thank you. How do you know how much water you have in your well? And I discussed that briefly in my talk on the Groundwater 101. You can calculate how much water is stored in your well. That's one part of that. But you need to know the depth of the well. You need to know the setting of your pump, and you need to know your static water level. And if you can find a well completion report with a pump installation report, you can figure out most of that. Static water levels change over time. And you can have a pump test done that'll tell you what your static water level is, because if you know the water level over your pump, the diameter of your well, then you can back out how much water is stored. Now you need to do a pump test to know how much it will produce. That's the other side to that question. And that pump tests, I think they've come a long way from what they used to do. We try to have them done with the 4-hour required by the county. You want to get an idea what the sustained yield is, not just, oh, turn on the pump and I'm pumping 10 gallons a minute for an hour. Well, that may just be depleting storage. You need to have somebody qualified to come up with an answer of what does the aquifer yield. And that can be estimated by how quickly the water level returns to static. It's not easy. You have to have the right data to go. We have access to, well, Roy has some water level meters. That's a line that goes down in your well. We also have access to an acoustic meter. If you want to know, and you at least know the depth of the well and the pump, let us know, and we could come out and see if one of these water level meters works. It doesn't always work. The acoustic doesn't work if it's really deep and there's a lot of wiring, and the pumpless, the adapter to hang the pump, pitless adapter gets in the way. So I hope that answers that one. I am concerned with the proposed development of a Class 3 commercial bike park on Shadow Mountain Drive that will directly negatively affect water quality with new people, up to 1,200 people a day. That is on Turkey Creek and the wetland area. There will also be a 300-space parking lot. One thing I will say relative to Russ's concerns is that'll have a wastewater treatment facility on it that should be state-of-the-art and is going to be required to meet the TMDL for phosphorus. Whether it works or not, I don't know. The other aspects of this, does anybody feel?
It only needs the wastewater treatment facility that exceeds that 2,000 gallons. So that's the criteria. So it does.
We can't hear you.
I mean, the criteria for a wastewater treatment facility is it has to exceed that 2,000 gallons per day. And so once it's determined in the process, if it's going to, then that's going to say you need a wastewater treatment facility permitted through the state. And then there are all kinds of specific elements required in that permit. And of course, phosphorus is just one. You have all of the other aspects that have to be met. But that criteria first is the development going to exceed 2,000 gallons per day? We don't, as an association, even though we are a management agency, we're both state and federally recognized, we don't make that determination. We get that information. We rely on the county to come back in and say, we're looking at this, and if indeed the county comes back in and as a part of this whole development process says, you're going to exceed this particular threshold, then we're involved because we'll have to come back in and look at the proposal for the permits. There has to be there's a set of numbers that the state has to generate, but that's a big process. So right now, everybody tries to avoid that, doing that one. minimum time requirement to be able to go from now to putting in a wastewater treatment facility within this watershed, 2.5 years. So everyone's going to look for, in fact, there are others out there that are looking for, are there ways that you don't end up having to have a permanent system? That'll be the key. So if it's determined that you've got this visitation, this is the flow that's going to be generated, and then if it exceeds that threshold, well, then it becomes a whole different ballgame.
So Russ did a great job at answering the water treatment of the on-site wastewater that's generated. But I did also want to let you guys know that with parking areas, one of the things that is evaluated by our engineering and that we always have to get with any development is detention, stormwater detention. So once any new impervious area is created, our engineers analyze that and see how much water will hit that impervious area and run off, and what kind of detention is needed so that that water does not just release straight into the stream, but that it is detained for a while so that any particulate matter can kind of settle out before it is then released into the stream. I think the objective is 72 hours for that to remain in that detention pond and slowly be released to the stream. So I just wanted to give you an update on that too.
All right, here's one that I'll try to answer, but Roy will probably be able to elaborate better. Why do I get tannins in water every spring? Stop dumping those red wine bottles by your well. No, seriously, you need to look at what your well completion report shows. If you can find it, there's supposed to be a minimum of 19 feet of surface casing to start with. Whether that was installed at all or properly, it depends on how old your well is. If the surface casing was properly grouted in place, because remember the first water I mentioned, and the regolith underflow. In the spring, that regolith, which is the weathered bedrock close to the surface, is loaded with water. It's all that snow melt recharging our aquifer, but it lingers in that regolith. That's where your tannins are getting picked up. If your first water is fairly close to the base of your surface casing, it may see the tannins and other things. It may get cloudy. Let's see, if you don't have a properly grouted surface casing or wasn't deep enough, there are a number of factors, but what you're seeing is that spring meltwater of snow coming into the system close to the surface.
Well done. Yeah, so where do tannins come from? Thank goodness for smartphones. Are chemical compounds that occur naturally in plants, including the bark, wood, leaves, buds, stems, fruits, seeds. Right. So all this, and especially if you live in a pine forest where there's a lot of the duff, the pine needle drop off, or leaves, or anything like that. That's all that organic material in there. Then, as Peter said, springtime, we get the snow melt, the snow thaw, and we've got all this material available, so that gets picked up in this, fresh water that's recharging the aquifer. So that's why that surge at that particular time of year, spring. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
This one, maybe Roy and John talk about. Explain what new EPA regs regarding PFOS, the forever chemicals, will have on all of the Conifer water and sanitation districts. Will these new requirements affect Shadow Mountain bike parks, well and on-site wastewater treatment systems?
The PFAS?
Yes.
The PFAS is going to probably affect every centralized system in Conifer over time. Just as TDS keeps getting recirculated in our systems, we keep recharging the systems, these chemicals are not going to be, if they get into the system, it's going to be hard to get them out unless there's some RO or activated carbon filters used to, in a wastewater or centralized system wastewater treatment.
So with PFAS, and then actually we just use that, it's actually a whole class of these chemicals that just recently, so prior to about a month and a half ago, it was simply guidance, national guidance on what the level should be, and they were set higher. And what we have now is we now actually have regulation that is set in these new numbers, the 4 parts per trillion that we're looking at. Really the big answer on this one is we don't, even though you saw some of the information, most of the facilities are not tested. Or some of the facilities that did test for this early on didn't have to report it. And if you don't have to report it, you don't report it. So the first process, because this is a new rule that's coming out, it's going to be a immensely costly process to address PFAS and related compounds, is that there's a process started by the state right now to get different entities to begin to actually do the test results, turn in the test results so that we can get a better status of where we are. At this point in time, there's really no implementation process that's been put in. This is not something that's gone to the Water Quality Control Commission. This will be on the agenda coming up there. So we're in the beginning phases. So when you get something of this complicated that we are talking not billions, we're talking trillions of dollars, the money's not there. You know, even having the cleanup, we talked a little bit about, you know, we're saying, oh, let's go to activated carbon or let's go to RO. Now what are you going to do when you have millions of these cartridges or millions of tons of this material that is contaminated? So that's an issue that's going to have to be addressed. So this whole PFAS is very complex. Yes, the fact that there is a lot of people that have been exposed or continuing to be exposed, but right now, from a regulatory standpoint, we actually don't have anything that other than really finding out the extent of the problem, both in surface water, wastewater, and even in groundwater systems. But we know it's out there.
The last one, what about all building going on? How hard on our water aquifer? Several ways to look at this, and you know, John and I have been looking at our water levels given these continuous loggers, right? And we've got a little postage stamp of an activity center that we're taking a look at. And right now, what we see is there's no firm evidence of wholesale depletion of our savings account. With the level of activity here right now, we seem to be holding steady. Now, with climate change, that's going to have an impact on it. Going back to the water balance, there's no free lunch. There will be consumptive use of the water we're pumping out. And so there is a loss to our water balance, but it doesn't seem to be taking significantly out of storage. So it has to be taken from somewhere else. Russ showed a slide of the inflow to Bear Creek that shows a long-term decline of inflow into the reservoir. That tells me what we're probably taking from is our underflow contribution to our surface water system. So we are impacting, our savings is holding steady, but we're taking from Russ. He says there's mining. We are mining it, but we're taking it from the people downstream. And that's why we have augmentation plans, there are some surface water rights that are being impacted by that, and hopefully the augmentation plans are taking care of them. Today, it looks like things are copacetic, but climate change is going to have another impact. So any other comments on that?
Another thing to consider when you're looking at the snow melt and stuff that's coming in, and even your graphs and stuff are kind of treated as if it's instantaneous. It's not. Probably the classic example was done in the Cherry Creek Basin, where they're doing land applications on golf courses near the town of Parker. So they did some very elaborate studies down there, and this is more of an alluvial aquifer, so things move through it a whole lot easier than this crystalline one. The water that's introduced in Parker takes 30 years to get to Cherry Creek Reservoir. From a regulatory standpoint, it's being treated as if it's instantaneous. But it's a thing to consider is that when we have snow melt and stuff, the water that's at the surface, before it gets back down there, it takes a period of time. So there's an infiltration rate, and that's a piece of the puzzle that we really don't have a good handle on.
All right, I see we're just about out of time, and Shirley would like to make a comment. I'd like to thank the speakers. I'd also like to thank the audience for well thought out, good questions. It looks like we have one more.
I didn't have a question to comment on a couple of things that you talked about. You mentioned, I think, quite clearly in your presentation on the difference between your pump yield and your aquifer yield. And I think when you run pump tests or you have somebody do a pump test, make sure that the testing is done from the well directly out. If you run it through the house and through your pressure tank, you're not getting an accurate test. You're only testing what the storage in the well is and so on. So you're better to have your pump guy run it directly from the pump out so that you can test what the yield of the aquifer is and rather than what's in storage. The other comment I wanted to make is some of you that have talked about hard water, if you see the calcium, magnesium, the white crustation on your faucets and so on, if you get that on your faucets, one of the solutions I found years ago, if you go to get two magnets, 6-inch by 1-inch by 1/2-inch thick, and put those magnets North Pole to North Pole on your inlet, duct tape them to your inlet pipe, it'll cut down all of that incrustation tremendously. With regard to coloration in the wells and so on from the tans and lignins, I find that if you put a trench around the uphill side of your wellhead, you'll find that reduces that somewhat. It won't take it out totally, but it reduces that surface water coming down to getting into the adjacent to the well. So just a little trench above and berm it around that'll solve that. With regard to the Conifer area issue, years ago I did that study before it used to be the Conifer, or it used to be the Safeway Market, and now it's the Staples in Riley. I did that study and we argued that in the water court in Greeley. And to your knowledge, there's a fault that runs right across that whole area, and that fault has very impermeable clays in it. So there's a difference between the water levels on one side, up in the back side of that complex, to the downhill side. And what the conclusion was in the water courts is we got the developer to put in several 1,000-gallon storage tanks up behind the Staples there. So there's some storage tanks up there. So we found in those tests that they're 130 feet away, that there was an effect when we pumped one well and measured water levels in the others during the pump test. And 130 feet away, there was no influence. And then several hundred feet away, there was an influence. So there's a difference there. And when we found that difference, and I investigated that, that's where we found a fault with the permeable materials in it. As far as radon in your water, I think it was expressed greatly, and that is that radon is, there's a test that was, not a test, a conference that was held at Colorado State University on that whole issue. And Roy, if you give me a call, I don't know where I got that report, but I've got it somewhere. But at any rate, there was a whole one-day conference just on that issue. And they've done studies in Connecticut and New England where they've got the same problem. And the whole big issue, as Roy pointed out, it's the air quality that is the key. And if you got smokers, if you're a smoker, you're more apt to get harmed by that. So anyway, those are just comments I wanted to make regarding what you covered. And I thank you all for your presentation. I think it was great. I think you need to do it more often in other parts of the county so that people can get a general idea, because this whole groundwater issue is a mystery to a lot of people. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. You know, we have some incredible, knowledgeable experts here from some very special authorities and agencies, so thank you so much for coming. Oh my goodness, this is great. We also have a lot of incredible people out in the audience that know a lot. But I especially want to thank Peter and John. They are really looking out for the conifer community. They're working with all of these experts. And please, a round of applause for Peter and John. Did you want to say anything else? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And the next time we do this, we need to have more people. So bring out your friends and neighbors. Thank you. We'll do it a different day.